August 15, 1945, Victory over Japan Day. Across America, sirens wailed in celebration, and confetti rained from office buildings onto jubilant crowds below. In prisoner of war camps from California to Texas, Japanese soldiers and auxiliary personnel prepared for repatriation to their defeated empire. But in a modest facility outside Sacramento, California, something extraordinary was unfolding. When American commanders announced to a group of Japanese women prisoners that they were free to return home, several of them did the unthinkable. They hesitated. They looked at each other with tears in their eyes, and then they asked if they could stay just a little longer. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Japanese Women's Auxiliary Service, captured during the final desperate months of the Pacific War. Young women who had served the empire in various capacities, now facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. What could possibly make someone reluctant to accept freedom and return to their own country? Before we discover what transformed these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story that led to this moment began 6 months earlier, but its most pivotal turning point happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in April. That was the day the American Guards served hot dogs with mustard for lunch. To the Americans, it was just another casual meal, barely worth mentioning. To the Japanese women prisoners, it felt like a festival day, a celebration, an act of incomprehensible generosity that shattered everything they had been taught about their captors. 23-year-old Keiko Matsumoto stood in the mess hall line that day, her stomach tight with the familiar ache of modest rations. She had been a radio operator for the Imperial Army, stationed in the Philippines when American forces overran her position. For 3 months, she had been a prisoner, expecting harsh treatment, perhaps even torture. That's what the propaganda films back home had promised. Americans were devils, brutal and merciless, especially toward Japanese women. But when the guard placed a hot dog on her tray, slathered with bright yellow mustard, Keiko froze. The portion was generous, almost excessive. The bread was soft and white, unlike anything she had seen in years of wartime rationing. Next to her, Yuki Tanaka, a former nurse from Osaka, whispered in Japanese, "Is this a special day? Why are they feeding us like this?" The two women carried their trays to a table, moving slowly, reverently, as if the food might disappear if they moved too quickly. Around them, other Japanese women prisoners wore expressions of equal confusion and wonder. They had been taught that Americans would starve them, work them to death, treat them as less than human. Yet here was food that seemed fit for a celebration, served on a regular Tuesday with no ceremony, no explanation, just casual American. Abundance that felt almost obscene in its generosity. Keiko lifted the hot dog to her lips, and in that moment, everything she thought she knew about her enemy began to crack. February 19th, 1945. The war in the Pacific raged with unprecedented brutality, and nobody expected mercy on either side. When the first transport truck arrived at the newly established women's facility outside Sacramento, 28 Japanese women stepped down onto American soil as prisoners of war. They ranged in age from 19 to 36, captured across various Pacific territories as American forces advanced island by island toward Japan itself. The compound was smaller than the massive male POW camps scattered across the American West. Barbed wire surrounded a collection of hastily constructed barracks, a mess hall, and administrative buildings. Everything looked temporary, as if the Americans themselves weren't quite sure what to do with female Japanese prisoners. Unlike their male counterparts who were processed through established protocols, these women existed in a strange, legal, and bureaucratic limbo. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee the facility, watched the new arrivals with a mixture of professional duty and personal curiosity. She had volunteered for this assignment despite warnings from her superiors that working with Japanese prisoners would be psychologically challenging. Her younger brother, had died at Guadalcanal. She had every reason to hate these women, yet as she observed them filing off the transport vehicle, she saw something that caught her off guard. They looked terrified. Among the arrivals, Keiko Matsumoto clutched a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her family and a pressed cherry blossom from her childhood home in Kyoto. She had been a university student studying literature when the war began, then trained as a radio operator to serve the empire. Now, standing in enemy territory, she tried to maintain the dignified composure expected of Japanese women. But her hands trembled slightly as guards directed her toward the processing center. Next to her stood Yuki Tanaka, who had been a surgical nurse in Manila when American forces captured the hospital where she worked. Yuki's medical training had given her a practical, grounded perspective that many of the other women lacked. She noticed details the others missed. The guards' body language suggested discipline rather than cruelty. The facilities appeared clean and organized, and most surprisingly, the American female officer watching them wore an expression of cautious professionalism rather than hatred. The processing took hours. Names were recorded, personal belongings cataloged, uniforms exchanged for simple gray work clothes. Throughout it all, the Japanese women maintained almost complete silence, speaking only when directly questioned. Their answers delivered in halting, heavily accented English or through interpreters. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that capture meant certain death or worse. They were waiting for the cruelty to begin. But as the February sun set over the California landscape, something unexpected happened. Guards distributed wool blankets, adequate food portions, and assigned them to barracks with functioning heat. The women lay in their bunks that first night, confused and uncertain. Where was the torture they had been promised? Where were the devils? The first weeks in the camp passed in a fog of tension and uncertainty. The Japanese women moved through their daily routines mechanically, following orders without resistance but also without engagement. They ate their meals in silence, worked their assigned duties without complaint, and spent their free time huddled together in small groups, speaking only in whispered Japanese conversations that stopped abruptly whenever an American guard approached. Keiko found herself assigned to laundry duty alongside 6 other women. The work was physically demanding but not brutal. The Americans provided adequate soap, functional equipment, and regular breaks. It was so different from what she had expected that she found herself constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the facade of civility to crack and reveal the cruelty underneath. Lieutenant Morrison observed these dynamics with growing frustration. She had expected defiance, perhaps even attempts at resistance or escape. Instead, she encountered something more unsettling: complete emotional withdrawal. The Japanese women performed their duties adequately, but showed no personality, no individual characteristics, nothing that suggested they were anything more than automatons going through prescribed motions. One afternoon in early March, Morrison decided to try a different approach. She entered the laundry building and approached Keiko, who immediately stiffened and lowered her eyes in a gesture of submission that made Morrison uncomfortable. In careful, slow English, Morrison asked a simple question: "What did you do before the war?" The question hung in the air between them. Keiko's mind raced. Was this a trap? Some kind of interrogation technique? She glanced at Yuki, who stood nearby folding sheets, and saw the same confusion reflected in her friend's eyes. Finally, in halting English, Keiko answered, "Student, university, literature." Morrison felt something shift in that moment. Literature. This wasn't just an enemy soldier. This was a young woman who had been studying books, probably dreaming about her future, before the war consumed everything. She nodded slowly and asked another question. "What was your favorite subject?" Keiko's defenses cracked just slightly. Poetry, Japanese poetry, haiku. She paused, then added carefully, "English poetry too, Shakespeare." For the first time since arriving at the camp, Keiko saw something unexpected in an American's eyes. Not hatred, not suspicion, but genuine, interest. Lieutenant Morrison smiled slightly and said, "I studied literature too, before all this." She gestured vaguely at the camp, at the war, at everything that had brought them to this strange intersection of lives. That brief conversation rippled through the compound in unexpected ways. Other guards noticed Morrison's approach and began attempting similar small interactions. Nothing dramatic, just simple human questions that acknowledged the prisoners as individuals rather than merely as enemies. At night, lying in her bunk in the dark barracks, Keiko's mind drifted back to the propaganda films she had watched in Tokyo before being deployed overseas. The images had been vivid and terrifying. American soldiers depicted as demons with exaggerated features, torturing prisoners, committing unspeakable atrocities against Japanese civilians. The narrator's voice had been urgent and absolute, warning that capture meant a fate worse than death. She remembered her training instructor, a stern woman in her 40s who had survived the bombing raids on Tokyo, standing before rows of young female auxiliaries and delivering a chilling warning. "If you are captured, the Americans will show no mercy. They see us as less than human. They will use you, break you, and discard you. It is better to die with honor than to fall into their hands." Yuki had received similar indoctrination during her medical training. The propaganda had been even more specific for nurses, warning them that American soldiers particularly targeted medical personnel for abuse. She had been told stories, whether true or fabricated she couldn't say, of Japanese nurses being tortured for information about troop movements and medical supplies. The message was clear and consistent. Americans were monsters who took pleasure in Japanese suffering. These beliefs had been reinforced by every official communication, every radio broadcast, every newspaper article they had encountered during the war years. The idea that Americans might be anything other than brutal savages had been systematically eliminated from acceptable thought. Doubting these truths meant doubting the empire itself, a dangerous form of disloyalty that could bring suspicion upon one's entire family. Yet now, 3 weeks into captivity, the disconnect between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing created a cognitive dissonance that left many of the women confused and frightened in new ways. If the propaganda had been wrong about American cruelty, what else might have been wrong? The question was dangerous, potentially treasonous, but it gnawed at them nonetheless. Keiko found herself watching the guards with new attention, looking for cracks in the facade of civility. She wanted to find evidence that would confirm her original beliefs, that would allow her to retreat into the certainty of hatred. Instead, she observed small acts that contradicted everything she knew. Guards who shared cigarettes with each other but never forced prisoners to work beyond reasonable hours. American women officers who maintained professional distance but never used deliberately cruel or demeaning language. One evening, a young guard named Private James Chen noticed that one of the Japanese women, a quiet girl named Hana, appeared to be fighting off a fever. Without being asked, he brought her extra blankets and a cup of hot tea. Hana accepted it with trembling hands, her eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been gratitude. The other women watched this exchange in silence, each of them processing what it meant when your enemy shows you unexpected kindness. March winds brought cold rain to Northern California, and the barracks, while adequate, weren't built for comfort. The women huddled under their issued blankets at night, listening to the rain drum against the metal roof, each of them trying to ignore the cold that seeped through the thin walls. They never complained. Complaining meant drawing attention, and attention from captors was something to be avoided at all costs. Private Chen had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the son of immigrants who had faced their own share of discrimination and hardship. He understood what it meant to be seen as perpetually foreign, perpetually suspect. When he looked at the Japanese women prisoners, he saw something beyond enemy combatants. He saw displaced people caught in circumstances beyond their control, just like his own parents had been when they arrived in America with nothing but hope and determination. On a particularly cold Tuesday night, Chen was assigned to evening patrol, walking the perimeter of the compound and checking that everything was secure. As he passed one of the women's barracks, he heard the sound of someone coughing persistently. The cough sounded harsh, rattling, the kind that suggested someone was fighting off illness without adequate warmth or care. Standard protocol would have been to note it in his report and let the medical officer address it in the morning. But Chen thought about his own grandmother, who had died from pneumonia one cold San Francisco winter when adequate medical care had been delayed too long. He made a decision that technically violated procedure, but felt morally necessary. Chen went to the supply depot and retrieved 2 extra wool blankets from the surplus stock. He also stopped by the kitchen, where night staff were cleaning up, and asked if he could have some hot water and tea. The kitchen staff, curious but not questioning, obliged. Carrying these items, Chen returned to the barracks and knocked softly on the door. Inside, the women tensed immediately. Night visits from guards could mean many things, few of them good. Keiko, who slept nearest the door, rose quickly and approached, her heart pounding. When she opened the door, she saw the young Chinese-American guard holding blankets and tea, his expression uncertain but kind. "Someone sick?" Chen asked, in simple English, gesturing toward the interior of the barracks. Keiko nodded slowly, then pointed to where Hana lay, shivering in her bunk. Chen entered carefully, respectfully, keeping his movement slow and non-threatening. He approached Hana and gently placed the extra blankets over her, then set the tea on the small table beside her bunk. "For cold," he said simply. "Keep warm. Feel better." Then he left, closing the door quietly behind him. The entire interaction had taken less than 2 minutes, but its impact would last far longer. The women sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. An American guard had shown them kindness, not for any strategic purpose, not to extract information or gain favor, but simply because someone was sick and needed help. The act of kindness from Private Chen created a subtle but significant shift in the compound's atmosphere. The Japanese women began to watch their captors with new eyes, looking for patterns that might explain this unexpected behavior. Were the Americans simply better at deception than they had been warned? Or was something more fundamental being challenged in their understanding of the enemy? Lieutenant Morrison noticed the change and decided to capitalize on it. She proposed to the camp commander that they establish voluntary English language classes for any prisoners interested in improving their communication skills. The commander, a practical man named Colonel Robert Hayes, approved the idea primarily for operational efficiency. Better communication meant fewer misunderstandings and smoother daily operations. The first class was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the camp's small recreation room. Morrison wasn't sure if anyone would attend. Participating might be seen by the other prisoners as collaboration with the enemy, a betrayal of Japanese loyalty. When she arrived at the designated time, she was surprised to find 12 women waiting, sitting in neat rows, their faces masks of careful neutrality. Keiko and Yuki were among them. Morrison began with simple vocabulary, writing words on a blackboard she had requisitioned from the camp's storage. "Hello, thank you. Please. Water. Food. Cold. Warm." She spoke each word clearly, then had the women repeat after her. Their pronunciation was hesitant, accented, but earnest. The formal structure of a classroom seemed to provide a safe framework for interaction, removing some of the charged tension of direct personal communication. As the weeks progressed, the classes became more ambitious. Morrison introduced basic grammar, simple conversational phrases, and eventually reading comprehension using elementary textbooks she had ordered from a nearby school district. Keiko's previous university education gave her an advantage, and she progressed rapidly, often helping translate difficult concepts for the other women. But the classes became more than just language instruction. They became spaces where careful, cautious, conversations about life beyond the war could occur. Morrison would ask questions about Japanese culture, about food traditions, about what daily life had been like before the conflict consumed everything. The women, initially suspicious of these inquiries, gradually began to share small details: how cherry blossoms meant spring was coming, how certain festivals marked the changing seasons, how families gathered for New Year's celebrations. Private Chen sometimes assisted with the classes, and his presence created an interesting dynamic. As a Chinese American, he existed in a space between the white American guards and the Japanese prisoners. His family had suffered under Japanese occupation in China, yet he treated the women with consistent respect and kindness. One day, Yuki gathered the courage to ask him a question that had been troubling her. "Why are you kind to us?" she asked in careful English. "Japan hurt China. Your family may be hurt by Japan." Chen considered the question seriously before answering. "My grandmother always said that hating people keeps you prisoner too. War makes everyone do terrible things, but war ends. Then we have to decide who we want to be after." His words, simple and direct, resonated with the women in ways that formal political speeches never could. They had been taught that Americans were incapable of forgiveness, that vengeance was the only response to defeat. Yet here was evidence of something different, something that suggested a more complex reality than their propaganda had allowed. April 17, 1945, arrived as an ordinary Tuesday. The women rose at dawn, completed their morning routines, and prepared for another day of work assignments and quiet endurance. The breakfast had been standard: oatmeal, toast, weak coffee. Nothing suggested that this day would become a turning point in their understanding of American captivity. Lunch was scheduled for noon, as always. The women lined up outside the mess hall in their usual orderly fashion, metal trays in hand, moving through the serving line with practiced efficiency. But when Keiko reached the front of the line, she stopped abruptly, causing a minor backup of women behind her. On her tray, the kitchen worker had placed something she had never seen before: a long, cylindrical piece of meat in a soft white bun, topped with a bright yellow condiment that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Hot dog," the kitchen worker said cheerfully, noticing her confusion. "With mustard, you'll like it." He added a serving of potato chips and a small portion of coleslaw before gesturing for her to move along. Keiko took her tray and walked toward the tables in a daze, staring at the strange food with complete bewilderment. Yuki received the same mysterious meal and joined Keiko at their usual table. Around them, the other Japanese women were experiencing identical confusion. What was this food? Why was it shaped so strangely? And most importantly, what did it mean that they were being served something that looked so abundant, so deliberately prepared, so unlike the simple functional meals they had been receiving? "Is this a special day?" Yuki whispered in Japanese, looking around for some explanation. "Are the Americans celebrating something? Why would they share celebration food with prisoners?" Keiko examined the hot dog from every angle, as if careful observation might reveal its significance. The portion was generous, almost excessive by wartime standards. The bread was soft and fresh, completely unlike the hard rations she remembered from her last month serving the Empire. The meat smelled rich and savory, and the yellow mustard added a tang that made her mouth water, despite her confusion. In Japan, special foods were reserved for festivals, for matsuri, for days of cultural or religious significance. You didn't serve elaborate meals casually. Every dish carried meaning, reflected care and intention. Surely this strange but clearly well-prepared food must indicate some kind of American holiday or celebration. But if so, why were prisoners being included? Why were enemies being treated to what appeared to be festival fare? Private Chen, who was supervising the mess hall that day, noticed the women's confusion and approached their table with a friendly smile. "Everything okay? You don't like hot dogs?" He seemed genuinely concerned that they might be dissatisfied with the meal. Keiko gathered her courage and asked in her improving English, "This special food? Today, American festival?" Chen looked puzzled for a moment. Then understanding dawned on his face, followed by something that might have been sadness mixed with compassion. "No festival," he said gently. "Just regular lunch. Americans eat hot dogs all the time. It's just, normal food." He walked away, leaving the women to process this staggering information. Normal food, this abundance, this care and preparation, this generous portion was just ordinary, everyday American eating. The implications were overwhelming. Keiko lifted the hot dog to her lips with trembling hands. The first bite was a revelation that went far beyond simple taste. The soft bread yielded gently. The meat was savory and rich, and the mustard added a sharp brightness that made the whole combination come alive in her mouth. She had been eating adequate but plain food for months. This was something else entirely. This was flavor, abundance, care put into something as simple as a casual meal. Around the mess hall, similar realizations were occurring simultaneously. Women who had expected to be slowly starved, who had prepared themselves for deliberate cruelty through deprivation, were instead experiencing American plenty in its most casual form. Some women began to cry quietly as they ate, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance between their expectations and their reality. Yuki ate slowly, methodically, her nurse's training allowing her to observe her own reactions with clinical detachment, even as emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She thought about the propaganda films that had shown Americans as wasteful, gluttonous people who hoarded resources while others starved. She had dismissed those characterizations as exaggerations designed to inspire hatred. But now she wondered if the propaganda had accidentally revealed a truth, just not the truth it intended. Americans did have abundance, but rather than hoarding it from prisoners, they were sharing it casually, as if feeding people well was simply the natural order of things. The meal reminded Keiko of Matsuri festivals back home, when her family would gather in Kyoto's streets during cherry blossom season. Vendors would sell yakitori, takoyaki, and other special foods that appeared only on festival days. The smell of grilling meat, the sound of laughter, the sense of community and celebration. She had thought those days were gone forever, lost to the war and her subsequent capture. Yet here, in an enemy prison camp, a simple hot dog had triggered memories of joy she thought had been permanently destroyed. "Why are they doing this?" whispered Hana, the young woman who had been sick and received blankets from Private Chen. She was 19 years old, the youngest among them, and her voice carried a note of desperate confusion. "I don't understand what they want from us." It was a question that haunted all of them. In their understanding of the world, kindness always came with strings attached, with expectations of reciprocation or ulterior motives. Enemies didn't feed you well unless they wanted something specific in return. Yet the Americans seemed to expect nothing beyond basic compliance with camp rules. They weren't interrogating the women for intelligence. They weren't forcing them into propaganda efforts. They were just, inexplicably, treating them like human beings who deserved adequate food and basic dignity. As the women finished their meals and cleared their trays, conversations began to emerge that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Small groups gathered in corners of the mess hall, speaking in low Japanese voices about what this casual abundance might mean. Some argued it was a trick, a way to soften them up before some future cruelty. Others suggested that perhaps the propaganda had been wrong about more than just American character. Maybe everything they had been taught deserved reconsideration. Keiko said nothing during these debates, but in her mind, something fundamental was shifting. The hot dog incident, as it came to be remembered among the women, marked the beginning of a new phase in their captivity. They began to pay closer attention to their surroundings, to observe the Americans with genuine curiosity rather than defensive wariness. What they discovered was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The casual abundance they had witnessed at that Tuesday lunch wasn't an aberration. It was simply how Americans lived. But as spring progressed toward summer, another reality began to intrude on their daily routines. The International Red Cross had established protocols for prisoners of war to send and receive mail from their home countries. Lieutenant Morrison helped the women prepare letters to their families, carefully explaining the rules about what could and couldn't be said, then sending them through proper channels. Keiko wrote to her parents in Kyoto, trying to convey in careful, censored language that she was alive and being treated adequately. She didn't mention the hot dogs or the English classes or the unexpected kindness of her captors. Those details seemed too complex, too likely to be misunderstood or to cause her family additional worry. Instead, she wrote simple facts. She was healthy, she was safe. She hoped they were surviving the increasingly desperate conditions in Japan. Yuki wrote to her younger sister, who had been living in Osaka working in a munitions factory. Her letter was similarly constrained by what was permissible to share, focusing on reassurances that she remained unharmed and hopeful about eventually returning home. She asked careful questions about family members, about neighbors, about the fabric of ordinary life that war had shredded. The letters were sent in March. By April, there had been no responses. By May, as news of devastating American bombing campaigns over Japanese cities reached the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts, the women began to understand why their letters remained unanswered. The addresses they had written to might no longer exist. The families they had tried to reach might be scattered, displaced, or worse. Lieutenant Morrison watched the women checking the mail distribution each day with increasingly desperate hope, only to turn away disappointed when nothing arrived. She had seen this same pattern with other prisoners of war, this gradual realization that the lives they had left behind might have been irreversibly destroyed. But it affected her differently with these women, perhaps because she had spent so much time teaching them English, learning about their lives before the war, seeing them as individuals rather than simply as enemy combatants. One afternoon in late May, Morrison found Keiko sitting alone in the recreation room, staring at a blank piece of paper. She had been trying to write another letter home, but couldn't find words that felt adequate to the uncertainty she faced. Morrison sat down across from her, saying nothing at first, just offering silent companionship. "My city, Kyoto," Keiko finally said in her careful English. "You know Kyoto? Very beautiful city. Old temples, gardens, culture." She paused, struggling with vocabulary and emotion. "I think maybe bombs destroy it. Maybe my family not there anymore. Maybe they try to leave, go to countryside. Maybe they..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Morrison had read the intelligence reports. She knew that American bombing campaigns had been deliberately targeting civilian areas to break Japanese morale. She knew that hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians had died in these raids. She also knew that her own brother had died at Japanese hands, that this war had been brutal and total on both sides. August 6, 1945. The morning began like any other in the Sacramento camp. The women completed their breakfast duties, attended their English class, and prepared for afternoon work assignments. Lieutenant Morrison arrived at the recreation room where she taught, but her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something the women had never seen before: visible shock and uncertainty. She stood at the front of the room, holding a newspaper with trembling hands. The headline was visible even from the back row, printed in enormous letters that suggested the magnitude of what had occurred. Keiko, whose English had become quite fluent, could make out the words, "Atomic bomb destroys Japanese city." Morrison seemed uncertain how to proceed. Standard protocol probably dictated not sharing such information with enemy prisoners, but these women would learn about it eventually. Better they hear it from someone who had spent months building trust with them than discover it through rumor and speculation. She cleared her throat and began to read the article aloud, translating difficult phrases into simpler English as she went. A new type of bomb, unprecedented destructive power. An entire city obliterated in seconds, tens of thousands dead instantly, more dying from burns and radiation. The city's name was Hiroshima. Most of the women had heard of it, though none were from there. It was a significant military port, they knew, but also home to hundreds of thousands of civilians. The women sat in stunned silence as Morrison finished reading. The scale of destruction was difficult to comprehend. How could one bomb destroy an entire city? Was this American propaganda, an exaggeration designed to terrify Japan into surrender? Or was it real? And if it was real, what did it mean for everyone they had left behind? Yuki raised her hand slowly, her face pale. How many people live in Hiroshima? Before bomb? Morrison checked the article. The report estimates between 300,000 and 400,000 residents. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Yuki's hands began to shake. My cousin, she married a man from Hiroshima. They live there, I think. They're children. Her voice trailed off into horrified silence. Over the next 3 days, more information filtered into the camp. A second atomic bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki. Japan's military leaders were meeting to discuss surrender. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The empire was collapsing from all sides simultaneously, and the end was coming not with a negotiated peace, but with absolute, total defeat. The Japanese women gathered in small groups during their free time, speaking in hushed Japanese voices about what this meant. Some clung to desperate hope that their families had evacuated the cities before the bombs fell. Others had fallen into a numb depression, unable to process the magnitude of loss their country was experiencing. Keiko sat in the barracks holding her unanswered letters from home. She thought about Kyoto's ancient temples, its carefully preserved gardens, its centuries of culture and art. Had it been destroyed too? In the aftermath of the atomic bomb revelations, the camp fell into a strange, heavy silence. The Japanese women moved through their routines mechanically, their faces reflecting a grief too vast for easy expression. Lieutenant Morrison and the other American staff struggled with their own complex emotions. They had celebrated news of Japan's imminent surrender, the end of a brutal war that had cost so many American lives. Yet they had also watched the women under their care receive devastating news about their homeland with genuine compassion. Private Chen, observing the women's despair, suggested an idea to Lieutenant Morrison. In traditional Chinese and Japanese culture, gardens served as spaces for meditation, healing, and connection to something larger than individual suffering. What if the prisoners were allowed to create a small garden in an unused corner of the compound? Morrison brought the proposal to Colonel Hayes, who considered it carefully. The war was ending, repatriation would begin soon, and allowing the prisoners some constructive activity might ease the transition period. He approved the request with the provision that the garden area would remain within clear sight of the guard towers, and that no tools larger than small hand trowels would be permitted. When Morrison announced the garden project during English class, she saw the first spark of genuine interest in the women's eyes since the bomb news had arrived. Keiko immediately thought of her family's small garden in Kyoto, how her mother had tended it with such care, teaching her daughter the names of plants and the proper seasons for different flowers. Creating a garden here wouldn't bring back what was lost, but it might provide a tangible connection to cultural traditions that felt increasingly distant. The women worked together to design their garden plot. They had limited resources, just a small patch of ground measuring roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, but they approached the project with the same meticulous attention Japanese culture brought to all aesthetic endeavors. Yuki sketched rough designs based on gardens she remembered from her childhood. Hana, whose father had been a farmer before the war, advised on which vegetables might grow well in California's climate. American guards watched with curiosity as the Japanese women transformed a bare patch of dirt into something ordered and beautiful. They used rocks from around the compound to create borders and pathways. They planted vegetables from seeds donated by local farmers who had heard about the project. They even created a small area with sand that they raked into traditional patterns, a miniature version of the rock gardens found in Zen temples. The garden became more than just a project. It became a space where the women could process their grief and uncertainty while doing something constructive and life-affirming. Working with soil and seeds, watching new growth emerge from apparent barrenness, provided a metaphor they desperately needed. If plants could grow in this foreign soil, perhaps they too could survive transplanting and transformation. One afternoon, as Keiko carefully transplanted seedlings, Morrison approached her with news. "Keiko, we received word about Kyoto. American military command decided not to bomb it. They recognized its cultural significance. The city survived intact." Keiko's hand stilled in the soil. Tears began streaming down her face, but for the first time in weeks, they were tears that contained some element of relief mixed with the grief. As summer progressed and Japan's surrender became imminent, a local Methodist church in Sacramento initiated an outreach program to the POW camp. Reverend Thomas Wheeler had proposed the idea to his congregation, arguing that Christian compassion demanded they extend friendship even to former enemies, particularly to women who were far from home and facing uncertain futures. The proposal had been controversial. Many church members had lost sons or brothers in the Pacific War and felt no obligation to comfort Japanese prisoners. But Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, a schoolteacher in her 50s, had been moved by Reverend Wheeler's appeal. She volunteered to be among the first visitors, bringing with her a small group of women from the church's social committee. Colonel Hayes had approved the visits with strict guidelines. Meetings would occur in the recreation room under supervision. No gifts of significant value could be exchanged. The first visit was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late July, and Lieutenant Morrison informed the prisoners that participation was entirely voluntary. To Morrison's surprise, nearly all the women chose to attend. Keiko admitted to Yuki that she was nervous about meeting American civilians. Soldiers and guards existed within a clear framework of military hierarchy, but regular American families represented something more ambiguous and potentially more judgmental. When Mrs. Henderson and her group arrived, the initial atmosphere was stiff and formal. The American women sat on one side of the recreation room, the Japanese prisoners on the other, with Morrison serving as translator for those whose English remained limited. Small talk about weather and general pleasantries filled the first awkward minutes. Then, Mrs. Henderson noticed the photographs one of the Japanese women, a quiet prisoner named Sachiko, had brought to the meeting. They showed Sachiko's family before the war: parents, siblings, nieces, and nephews. Mrs. Henderson asked if she could look at them more closely. As she examined the images, her expression softened visibly. "Your family is beautiful," she said simply. "I have 3 children myself." She pulled out her own wallet and showed photographs of her family. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from abstract pleasantries to the universal language of family, of children, of the everyday concerns that transcended national boundaries. Other women followed this example, sharing photographs, talking about siblings and parents, discussing the mundane details of pre-war life that were simultaneously ordinary and precious. Keiko found herself describing her university studies to Mrs. Henderson, who taught literature and was genuinely interested in comparing Japanese and American educational approaches. The cultural exchange extended to practical demonstrations. Some Japanese women showed their visitors how to fold origami, creating paper cranes and flowers from scraps of available paper. In return, American women shared recipes for traditional American dishes. The hot dogs that had seemed so exotic to the prisoners became a subject of cross-cultural discussion, with American women explaining the history of this quintessentially American food and Japanese women describing festival foods from their own tradition. As the afternoon concluded and the visitors prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson approached Lieutenant Morrison with a request. "Could we come back? Maybe make this a regular thing? I think it's doing everyone good." August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio waves throughout Japan, announcing surrender in formal, archaic language most ordinary citizens struggled to understand. But the meaning was clear enough. The war was over. Japan had been defeated. The empire that had promised eternal victory had instead delivered absolute capitulation. News reached the Sacramento camp within hours. American guards and staff celebrated with restrained professionalism, aware that their joy might be painful for the prisoners to witness. Colonel Hayes ordered that no overt celebrations occur within sight of the Japanese women, but the atmosphere of relief and happiness was impossible to completely conceal. Lieutenant Morrison gathered the women in the recreation room to deliver the official announcement. She spoke in careful, clear English, knowing that most of them could now understand her without translation. "The war is over. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. You are no longer enemy combatants. Within the coming weeks, arrangements will be made for your repatriation to Japan." The words should have brought relief, perhaps even joy. Freedom, the ability to return home, the end of captivity. Instead, the women received the news with expressions of profound uncertainty and fear. What home were they returning to? What Japan awaited them after atomic bombs, conventional bombing campaigns, and total military defeat? Keiko sat motionless, her mind racing through possibilities. Kyoto had survived, Morrison had told her, but that didn't mean her family had survived. They might have been conscripted for war work, relocated to industrial areas that had been bombed, or simply died from disease or starvation during the final desperate months of the conflict. She had received no response to any of her letters. She would be returning to a country she no longer recognized, to search for people who might no longer exist. Yuki thought about her nursing skills and what role she might play in a defeated, occupied Japan. American forces would control the country now. Would former Japanese military personnel, even women who had served in auxiliary capacities, be trusted to work in hospitals? Or would they be viewed with suspicion, relegated to menial labor or worse? The future felt like a dark tunnel with no visible light at the end. That evening, the women gathered in small groups in their barracks, speaking in Japanese for the first time in weeks. The English classes, the garden project, the visits from American families had created a strange bubble of relative normalcy. Now that bubble was bursting, forcing them to confront the reality they had been temporarily sheltered from. Hana, the youngest among them, voiced what many were thinking but afraid to say aloud. "What if we asked to stay, just for a while longer, until we know more about what we're returning to?" The suggestion hung in the air like forbidden fruit. Prisoners asking to remain in captivity? It seemed absurd, possibly shameful. Yet, as the women considered it through the long night, the idea began to feel less like cowardice and more like survival instinct. They had found something unexpected in this American camp: safety, dignity, and the possibility of a future that wasn't defined entirely by their defeated past. The days following Japan's surrender brought a flurry of administrative activity to the camp. Officials from Washington sent detailed instructions about repatriation procedures. Transportation schedules were drafted. Medical examinations were scheduled to ensure all prisoners were healthy enough for the journey. The machinery of demobilization began grinding forward with bureaucratic efficiency. But among the Japanese women, a quiet rebellion was brewing. It started with whispered conversations that grew gradually bolder. Keiko, Yuki, and Hana formed the core of a group that was seriously considering the unthinkable, requesting permission to delay their return to Japan, or perhaps even to remain in the United States permanently if such a thing were possible. The practical arguments were compelling. Japan was devastated, occupied by foreign military forces, its infrastructure destroyed, its economy collapsed. The women had no confirmed information about their families' survival. They would be returning as defeated soldiers to a country that might view them with shame or suspicion. Moreover, many had skills that might be wasted in the chaos of post-war reconstruction, but there were deeper, more emotional reasons that were harder to articulate. Over 6 months of captivity, these women had experienced something they never expected. They had been treated with basic human dignity by people they had been taught to hate. They had formed relationships, developed new skills, and begun to imagine futures that didn't revolve around service to an empire that no longer existed. Keiko had flourished in the English classes, discovering talents for language and teaching she never knew she possessed. Mrs. Henderson had even suggested that Keiko might be able to continue her education in America if circumstances allowed. The idea had seemed like an impossible fantasy at the time, but now, with repatriation looming, it began to feel like a lost opportunity rather than a mere dream. Yuki had worked closely with the camp's medical staff, expanding her nursing knowledge and skills. Dr. Hayes, the camp physician, had remarked multiple times that she had natural talent that deserved proper formal training. In devastated Japan, such opportunities would be scarce. In America, they might be possible. The women understood that their request would be unprecedented and controversial. They would be asking their former enemies to allow them to remain in a country they had fought against, to build new lives in the nation that had defeated their homeland. Some would view this as betrayal, as abandonment of duty and country. Others might see it as practical survival, making the best of terrible circumstances. After days of intense discussion, the group decided to approach Lieutenant Morrison first. She had been their teacher, their advocate, and in many ways their bridge to understanding American culture. If anyone might help them navigate the complex process of making such an unusual request, it would be her. On a warm afternoon in late August, Keiko requested a private meeting with Morrison. When they sat down in the small office Morrison used for administrative work, Keiko's hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady as she began to explain what she and several others were considering. Morrison listened without interruption, her expression shifting from surprise to thoughtful consideration as Keiko laid out their reasoning. When Keiko finished, Morrison was silent for a long moment before responding. Lieutenant Morrison brought the women's request to Colonel Hayes, who stared at her in disbelief for several seconds before asking her to repeat what she had just said. The idea of prisoners of war requesting to remain with their captors had no precedent in his military experience. It fell into a bureaucratic gray area that existing regulations didn't adequately address. Hayes was a practical man who had spent 30 years in the Army learning to navigate complex situations. His initial instinct was to deny the request outright. Prisoners were repatriated, end of story. That was how wars ended. But something about the situation gave him pause. These weren't hardened soldiers or fanatical ideologues. They were young women who had served in auxiliary capacities and were now facing return to a homeland that existed only in ruins. He told Morrison he would refer the matter to his superiors in Washington and to the State Department, which would ultimately make any decisions about foreign nationals remaining in the United States. In the meantime, the women who had made the request should continue preparing for repatriation as planned. If circumstances changed, they would be informed. Word of the request leaked beyond the camp's boundaries within days. A journalist from the Sacramento Bee had contacts among the civilian staff and got wind of the unusual story. The resulting article, titled "Japanese Prisoners Asked to Stay in America," created immediate controversy in the local community and beyond. Letters to the editor poured in, revealing the deep divisions in public opinion. Some writers expressed outrage that enemy soldiers were being given special consideration when American boys were still dying in the Pacific Theater. Why should Japanese prisoners receive favored treatment when loyal American citizens of Japanese descent had been interned in camps throughout the war? The hypocrisy seemed glaring to these critics. Others took a different view. Reverend Wheeler wrote a passionate editorial arguing that Christian principles of forgiveness and redemption demanded that former enemies be given opportunities for transformation. Mrs. Henderson organized a petition among church members supporting the women's request, emphasizing the genuine remorse and personal growth they had witnessed during their visits to the camp. The debate reached beyond Sacramento. Newspapers in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and eventually national publications picked up the story. It became a symbol of larger questions about post-war reconciliation, about America's role in rebuilding defeated nations, about the possibility of individual redemption transcending collective guilt. Inside the camp, the Japanese women found themselves divided as well. Not all agreed with the request to stay. Some felt that duty demanded they return to Japan regardless of conditions there. Their country needed them, they argued, precisely because it was devastated and defeated. Running away to comfortable captivity in America felt like abandoning their responsibilities to help rebuild what had been destroyed. Sachiko, who had shared family photographs with Mrs. Henderson during that first visit, announced she would definitely return to Japan. "My family is there, somewhere," she said firmly. "Even if I can't find them, other families need help. How can I stay in comfort while my people suffer?" Her words carried moral weight that those choosing to stay found difficult to counter. September arrived with cooler temperatures and a decision from Washington that surprised everyone involved. The State Department, in consultation with military authorities, had determined that the Japanese women who wished to delay repatriation could be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. This status would allow them to remain temporarily in the United States while seeking sponsors and employment opportunities. However, they would no longer receive housing and support at the military facility. They would need to find American families or organizations willing to vouch for them and provide assistance during their transition to civilian life. The decision represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed for the unprecedented situation to move forward. Lieutenant Morrison called a meeting to explain the new status and its implications. Of the original group of 10 women who had expressed interest in staying, 3 immediately reconsidered. The uncertainty and difficulty of finding sponsors seemed more daunting than returning to familiar, if devastated, Japan. 7 women committed to pursuing the possibility of remaining in America. Keiko, Yuki, and Hana formed the core of this group, along with 4 others who had their own reasons for choosing this difficult path. Each would need to secure an American sponsor, find employment, and navigate the complex immigration bureaucracy that governed foreign nationals during the post-war period. Mrs. Henderson immediately volunteered to sponsor Keiko. She had grown deeply fond of the young Japanese woman during their conversations about literature and culture. More than that, she recognized genuine intellectual talent that deserved opportunity. She proposed that Keiko live with her family while working as a translator and potentially pursuing further education. Her husband, a banker, had connections that might help secure proper documentation and work permits. Dr. Hayes arranged for Yuki to continue her medical training under his supervision at Sacramento General Hospital. He convinced the hospital administrator that Yuki's skills and dedication made her an asset worth investing in, despite the controversial nature of employing a former enemy soldier. Yuki would live in the hospital's nurses' dormitory and work toward formal nursing certification while assisting with patient care. For the other women, the process was more challenging. Local church groups and community organizations debated whether to offer sponsorship. Some families stepped forward motivated by genuine compassion and belief in redemption. Others hesitated, worried about community backlash or uncertain about the practical implications of sponsoring former enemy nationals. Meanwhile, the women who had chosen repatriation began their own preparations. They would be transported to San Francisco, then board ships for Japan, as part of the massive repatriation effort that would return hundreds of thousands of Japanese military personnel and civilians to their homeland. Sachiko organized a small ceremony where departing and staying women could say farewell and exchange small handmade gifts. The night before the repatriation group was scheduled to leave, both groups gathered in the recreation room for a final meeting. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion. Women who had shared 6 months of captivity, who had supported each other through fear and uncertainty, were now separating to pursue radically different futures. They sang Japanese songs together, shared memories of home, and made promises to write letters if circumstances allowed. September 23, 1945, dawned gray and cool. The morning held that particular quality of light that makes everything feel both sharply clear and somehow distant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. 21 Japanese women prepared to board transport trucks that would take them to San Francisco, then to ships bound for their defeated homeland. 7 others prepared to begin new lives as displaced persons in America. The scene outside the camp's administration building was unlike any standard repatriation procedure. There were no formal military formations, no rigid protocols designed to maintain distance between captors and captives. Instead, the atmosphere resembled a community farewell, awkward and emotional in equal measure. American guards who had spent months working alongside these women came to say goodbye. Local families who had visited through church programs brought small gifts of food and practical items for the journey. Colonel Hayes gave a brief speech, his military bearing slightly softened by obvious emotion. "You came here as enemies," he said, addressing the assembled women. "You leave as individuals who have shown dignity, resilience, and the capacity for human connection even in difficult circumstances. Those returning to Japan carry our hope that they will help build a peaceful future. Those remaining in America carry our trust that they will contribute positively to our communities." Lieutenant Morrison struggled to maintain her composure as she spoke to the women she had taught for months. "You taught me as much as I taught you," she said simply. "You showed me that seeing people as individuals rather than as enemies is always the right choice, even when it's difficult." Keiko stood to respond on behalf of all the women, both those leaving and those staying. Her English had become fluent and confident, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We came to America believing we knew what Americans were. We believed the propaganda that told us you were cruel and merciless. Instead, you showed us kindness when you could have shown hatred. You treated us with dignity when you could have treated us with contempt. Those of us returning to Japan will carry these lessons with us. Those of us staying will spend our lives trying to be worthy of the trust you have shown us." The moment came for the departing women to board the trucks. Embraces were exchanged, promises to write were made. Tears flowed freely on both sides. Sachiko hugged Keiko tightly and whispered in Japanese, "Tell our story someday. Tell people that even in war, human kindness is possible." Then she climbed into the truck, joining the others who had chosen to face an uncertain future in their homeland rather than build new lives among former enemies. As the trucks pulled away, those remaining stood watching until the vehicles disappeared from view. They were no longer prisoners of war, but they were not yet truly free. They existed in a liminal space between their old identities and futures they could barely imagine. The camp that had been their home for 6 months would close within weeks. They would move to their sponsors' homes, begin new jobs, navigate a society that might view them with suspicion or hostility. But they had something they hadn't possessed 6 months earlier: hope that transformation was possible, that individuals could choose different paths than the ones prescribed by national conflict. 25 years later, on a spring morning in 1970, Keiko Matsumoto Henderson stood in the dining room of her Sacramento home, preparing lunch for a group of university students. She had become a professor of comparative literature at Sacramento State University, teaching courses on cultural exchange and translation. Her students often gathered at her home for informal discussions that extended beyond classroom walls. Today's menu included hot dogs with mustard. It was a deliberate choice, laden with personal significance that her American-born students couldn't fully appreciate. But when one student asked why she smiled so softly while arranging the simple meal, Keiko decided to tell them the story of that April day in 1945, when a casual American lunch had shattered her understanding of enemies and friendship. She described the confusion she and the other prisoners had felt, believing the hot dogs represented some kind of festival or special occasion. She explained how the realization that such abundance was simply ordinary American life had forced them to question everything they had been taught about their captors. The students listened with fascination as she wove together the larger narrative, the garden project, the English classes, the church visits, and ultimately the impossible choice between returning to devastated Japan or remaining with former enemies. Yuki had become Dr. Yuki Tanaka, head of nursing at Sacramento General Hospital. She had never married, dedicating her life to patient care and training new generations of nurses. She occasionally spoke at community events about forgiveness and the possibility of transformation, always emphasizing that redemption required action, not merely words or good intentions. The other 5 women who had chosen to stay had found their own paths. 2 had married. American soldiers, creating families that embodied reconciliation between former enemies. Others had pursued careers in teaching, social work, and translation services. All had maintained connections with each other, forming a small community bound by shared experience of transformation. Letters had flowed back and forth across the Pacific for years, maintaining connections with those who had returned to Japan. Sachiko had become a social worker in Osaka, helping displaced families rebuild their lives. She often wrote about how her experience in American captivity had taught her that former enemies could become partners in healing, a lesson she applied daily in her work with communities devastated by war. The story of the Japanese women who hesitated when offered freedom had become a footnote in military history, a curious anomaly in repatriation records. But for those who had lived it, the story represented something more profound. It demonstrated that even in humanity's darkest moments, individual people could choose to see beyond hatred, to recognize the humanity in their enemies, and to build futures based on compassion rather than vengeance. Keiko concluded her story by holding up a photograph from that final day at the camp, showing women from both groups standing together before their separation. A hot dog with mustard taught me that sometimes the most profound truths are delivered through the simplest gestures, she told her students. Abundance shared freely, kindness offered without expectation of return, and the willingness to see individuals rather than merely enemies. These are the things that end wars in human hearts, even after the shooting stops.